All right, let's try this again. So last week we did all kinds of radical stuff, right? We simplified, we multiplied, divided, we added, subtracted, all that stuff. Now we're going to put it together into an equation, and we're going to actually solve equations. Okay. Before we do that, I want to remind you how we solve these types of equations. Now, you'll notice in all these equations, what's the highest power? Which means they're quadratic, correct? Okay. Remember, with quadratic, we could put it on a graph and we look for the solutions on the x-axis. They'd be the x-intercepts, right? Or if there's only one type of variable, I can isolate it and solve for it, which if you look at every single one of these, there's only one type of variable, which means I can go ahead and just isolate it. Notice how it says the exact answer. Does everybody see that? So I don't want some big long decimal. Probably going to be a radical involved. Everybody good? Okay, so how do I isolate the m in number 1? What do I got to get rid of first? I got to move that 200 over. Once you do that, it looks like that. Now what? So now it looks like that. Now what? Square root it. Okay, to get rid of that little squared, we do the opposite, which is square rooting it. So what's m? You're close with just 10. Plus or minus 10. Remember, with that power of 2, that means there should be 2 answers, right? Okay, so either positive 10 or negative 10. Okay, good. Let's take a look at number 2. A little bit different this time. This time I got the squared outside the parentheses, right? Meaning that squared is the farthest thing away from that x. So how am I going to get rid of that squared? We're going to square root both sides. When you square root a square, it cancels out the square. So now all I have left is x minus 2. What is the square root of 25? Plus or minus 5. Everybody good there? Okay, now how do I isolate that x? We add 2 to both sides. Now, everybody sees that plus or minus, correct? So I have plus or minus 5 and then plus 2. So now I'm actually going to go ahead and find my answers. What is positive 5 plus 2? 7. What is negative 5 plus 2? So those would be my 2 answers. Everybody doing okay? You remember doing this way back when? I think this was February. Okay, what about number 3? I can't distribute because of the squared on the outside. I'm not going to do the square yet because you see how this square is dealing with those parentheses, which is where the x is? I'm going to divide by what? By 3. I want to get rid of this 3 first. So now I have x minus 5 squared. What's 15 divided by 3? 5. Now how do you get rid of that squared? You square root it. Is 5 something that is easy to square root? I'm going to leave it because it is not a perfect square. And my answers say exact, don't they? That's an irrational number. The easiest way for me to write that is to keep the radical over it. Now, how do you get rid of that 5? Add 5. Okay, so now I have x equals plus or minus the square root of 5 plus 5. Now, if I type this into my calculator, what kind of number is it going to give me? How big of a decimal? Irrational one, right? And it says I want exact, doesn't it, in my directions? So we're going to leave it just like that. That's exact. No reason to try and write out all those decimals from your calculator. All right, and number 4, how am I going to isolate that t? Okay. So now I have 7t squared equals 448. Then what? Not yet. Divide by 7. Just hold that thought for a second.
program across from the middle school library seniors to turn in your Chromebooks. So we'll start with students' last names Emily Engenbrandt through Trevor Esker.
What is?
Bring your Chromebooks and your cases and your straps and everything to the Ed Tech room across from the middle school library. Emily Engenbrandt through Trevor Esker.
Oh, that's gross. What is 448 divided by 7? 64. Oh, that's nice. All right, so this is 64. Now, how do I get rid of that squared? Square root it. Wonderful. Is that all ringing a bell to you, folks? Any questions on that first row? No? You sure? Okay, let's go to the next row. What do you think about number 5 here? Divide it first. Now, does 529 divide by 64? It does not. It's a big old long decimal, isn't it? So guess what, folks? I'm going to leave it. Now, I bet you it would change it into a mixed number for you, but I don't think there's any reason to change it into a mixed number. Can somebody tell me why? It's not going to be harder. It really will still do it for you. It's a whole number because it's a perfect square, because we're definitely going to square root this now, aren't we? But do you guys see that 529 and that 64? Those are both perfect squares. How do I take the square root of a fraction? Square root both the top and the bottom. So what's the square root of 529? Perfect square, right? What's the square root of 64? So this will be plus or minus 23 over 8. And again, your calculator would do that for you. Okay, but easy enough just to do it that way. Okay, how about number 6? What do you think? Square root it first. What is the square root of 441? Is that perfect? What is it? So I'm going to say plus or minus 21 because I just did square root it, so we need that plus or minus. Now what are you going to do? Add the 9 to both sides. So now I have plus or minus 21 plus 9. Well, I can figure that out because there's no more radicals in it, right? Positive 21 plus 9, 30. How about negative 21 plus 9? There we go. There would be our two answers. So do you understand when to leave the radical in there and when to not leave the radical in there? Basically, if they're perfect, there's going to be no radical. How about number 7? What is 20 divided by 2? Does that need a plus or minus on it? No, because I haven't square rooted anything yet, have I? Now what? Okay. Is 10 a perfect square? It is not. So I'm just going to leave it as plus or minus the square root of 10. Now what do I need to get rid of? Okay. So I have x equals plus or minus the square root of 10 minus 4. Can I do that on my calculator? What do you think? It's a big, long, irrational decimal, right? So we're going to leave it just like that. All right, folks, was that my last one, warm-up wise? Okay. Now, there's a reason that I had that for your warm-up. That's just not a random thought, okay? And hopefully you'll see that here in a minute. Notes for today. Radical equations are equations with square roots. Everybody's perfectly clear that square roots and radicals mean the same thing, correct? I think I probably say radicals more than I do square roots, but they mean the same thing. So look at all your equations down there. First of all, are they all equations? Because what do they have in them? Equal signs. Now, do they all have radicals or square roots in them? Yes, they do. Okay. For us, meaning right now, today, they will only have one type of variable. Therefore, to solve, you must isolate the radical. You all know when there's one type of variable, that's what we do, right? Try and get it by itself. So we're going to isolate the radical. How do you cancel out a radical? What's the opposite of a radical? No, a radical is a square root. What's the opposite of a radical? Let me ask you this. What's the opposite of squaring something? So what's the opposite of square rooting something? Squaring it. There we go. We are going to square both sides. So in the warm-up problems, you had a square that you had to square root, correct? Now we have a square root that we have to square. See how we're just going the other way? Okay, so what do you think? Number one, what do I need to get rid of first? What is farthest away from that a on the same side? How do I get rid of it? Subtract it. So I have the square root of a plus 5, and now that equals 5. Everybody doing okay? Now you notice this a right here and that 5 are all under the radical, correct? I got to get rid of it. How do I get rid of a radical? You're going to square both sides. When you square a square root, it cancels out. So now I just have a plus 5 equals, what is 5 squared? 25. Nobody's going to tell me that 5 squared is 10, right? I hope not. So now what are you going to do to solve? And a is, how do I check to see if I'm correct? Plug it in. Now, folks, I want to ask you a couple questions here before we plug it in. In the warm-up, we always had two answers. It was plus or minus, correct? Because we took the square root of something. Agreed? When we solved this, did we ever take the square root of it? No. So that's why there's not a plus or minus. In fact, this equation has a highest power of 1, doesn't it? Meaning it should only have one answer. We've talked about that. If the highest power is 2, it has 2 answers. If the highest power is 1, it has 1 answer. Good? Okay, let's check it. Here we go. If I put that 20 right there, what's 20 plus 5? What's the square root of 25? Plus 7. 12. Bingo, right? That's what I want it to equal. Everybody good? Do I need to open a couple windows to get warm in here? We doing okay or not? You're fine? Okay. Number 2. What do I need to get rid of? How? What's the new equation? Everybody following those two gentlemen? Okay. Anything else outside of the radical that I need to get rid of? No, everything else is left underneath there, isn't it? So now how do I get rid of the radical? You're going to square both sides. How we doing up here? Good? So 36 equals, what does it equal on that side? Yeah, the square root just canceled itself out. It's gone. Now how do we solve? And you get... Okay, let's check it and see if it's right. If I put that 39 up there, what is 39 minus 3? Square root it. 6. Subtract 2. Bingo. 4. That's what we want it to equal. See how we're checking that to see if it's good or not? Yeah? Okay, another one, number 3. What do I need to get rid of? The 4. Good. How? Yeah, it's a positive 4 out there. So let's subtract it. Now I have h plus 1 equals, what, 10? Okay. Anything else outside of that radical that I need to get rid of? Just the radical itself, right? And how do I do that? Square it. So now I have h plus 1 equals 100. Should we check it just because? Sure. If I put a 99 in there, what's 99 plus 1? Square root it. 10. 4 plus 10. Bingo. Questions on what we're doing here today, folks? Nobody? Okay. Moving on. Number 4, what do you think? So 15 minus 8 is 7. And now I just have the square root of x minus 3. And then we're going to square both sides. So 7 squared is, and then the radical and the squared cancel, leaving us with just x minus 3. Gives me 52 equals x. Wonderful. And of course, you could go back in there and plug it in if you wanted to, and it should work out. Everybody doing okay? Sure? Okay, what do you think about number 5? Yeah, there's nothing outside the radical this time, is there? So I'm not going to square root it. I'm going to square it. So if I square both sides, like that. Good. We remember divide by -1, so b is. Now let's check this one because this one looks a little funny, right? Okay. If I put a -64 in there, basically that'll be a negative 64, right? Which is positive 64. What's the square root of 64? Bingo. Okay. What do you think about number 6? What am I trying to isolate? The x, right? Is there anything around the x I need to get rid of? No. Just the square root symbol, right? How do I get rid of the square root symbol? Now, am I concerned about getting rid of this square root? No, I'm just trying to get the x by itself, right? So I need to square it, but whatever I do to one side, I have to do. Now, I want you to notice this is 2 things over here. I have this 4 and I have that radical. The whole thing needs to be squared. James, how we doing, dude? Good. Whole thing needs to be squared, which means I have to square both of those things. What is 4 squared? What is the square root of 3 squared? Okay, now, if I say the square root of 3 squared, that means there's 2 of them, right? Isn't that what it means to square something, right? 2 of them? So aren't these both under the radical? So I can multiply those, can't I? Which gives me square root of 9. And what's the square root of 9? 3. Guys, that should make sense to us. If I square a square root, doesn't it just take the square root off? And what's happening between those 2 things? So we're multiplying there. And then over here, the square root and the square just cancel and we just get x. How are we doing? Fine? Okay, so what is 16 times that 3 then? So this would be 48 equals x. Good. That one's a little different, wasn't it? Okay, what do you think about number 7? Do I need to get rid of the 3 first or the 2? The 3 is correct. So 2 the square root of 4r equals 8. What do you think next? Divide by 2? So the square root of 4r equals 4. Square it to get rid of the square root. So the square root disappears. I have 4r equals 16. So r is good. Good. You guys like solving equations when we're isolating because you've been doing it for a long time, right? Remember, though, you always start farthest away and work your way back. What do you think about number 8? You guys see how I need to get rid of the 6, right? Is the 6 positive or negative? So we're subtracting it. So don't forget about the negative sign that is out in front of that radical. What is negative 2 minus 6? Negative 8. Not square it yet. We got to divide by -1 to cancel out the negative symbol. Square root of 2y equals positive 8. Now we're going to square both sides. Okay. 32. You took the square root. We're only dividing it by 2. Guys, remember, dividing by 2 and square rooting it does not mean the same thing. Okay. All right, got another one of these kind of different ones. Anything outside the radical I need to get rid of first. Am I concerned with that radical over there? No, I'm concerned with the one with the m. So we're going to square both sides. Now, folks, remember, there's two things. Oops. There's two things over here. So we need to square this whole thing. So I have m minus 5 equals, what's 4 squared? What's the square root of 3 squared? Times 3. Because remember, when you square a square root, they just cancel each other out. What is 16 times 3? We just did that one, right? Okay, and then how are you going to solve? Wonderful. So m is 50 what? 53. Good. Why don't you guys try number 10? See how you do. What'd you get rid of first? Did you subtract it? What did you get when you subtract it? Positive 7? Okay, so now that we got rid of the 2, what comes next? Square it. Okay. Okay. How'd we do? Everybody got 20 A-okay? You sure? Okay, in that case, why don't you do number 12, please? 12. 12. Do the one in the middle there, right? Number 12. Leave that fraction one for now. When you're done with 12, go to 13. And we'll leave that fraction one for the end. So you can check yourself. Number 12 should be somewhere between 80 and 90. Number 12 should be somewhere between 80 and 90. Number 13 should be somewhere between 90 and 100. How'd you do? Got 82? Okay. How we do on those? 2 for 2? No problems? Okay, let's go back to the fraction one. Okay, what are your thoughts? Besides it's a fraction, you don't want to do it. Okay.
Please excuse this interruption. At this time, we need the following seniors to report to the room across from the middle school library. Last name Fern through Maine. So, seniors, make sure you bring your Chromebooks, your cases, and your straps and everything that goes along with your Chromebooks. Turn it in. Joseph Fern through Amanda May. Thank you.
Square both sides. Remember, when you square it, folks, all you're doing is taking out that radical. Multiply by 5. Does everybody see why we multiply by 5? What is 36 times 5, by the way? And finally, and there we be. Not too bad, right? Good? Okay. Homework. Only 2 homeworks left. Yep. And there's your homework. Make sure you write the original problem, circle your final answer.